Good morning, everyone. One of the things that distinguishes human beings from animals is language. Unlike animals, people are able to communicate using words. In some ways, though, words have become cheap for many people in the Western world today. We are bombarded with words in advertising, at work, on TV, and the internet. With all the noise and confusion around words and their meaning, we may find ourselves longing for the oxygen of silence. Words may have become cheap for us, but in the thought world of the Bible, words carry real power. Today, we begin a new sermon series in Paul's words to the Thessalonians. Paul wrote 2 letters to the Thessalonians, but before we start into the letters themselves, we're going to take a closer look at Acts 17, which describes how the Thessalonian church got started. In Acts 17, we hear about the power of words for good and for harm. From verse 1, we read, "When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah," he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house." They were all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. May the Spirit of Jesus illuminate God's word for us. Acts 17, written by Luke, describes Paul and Silas's experience in the city of Thessalonica. 3 things we note. Paul's mission work is characterized by persuasion, protest, and persistence. Let's start with Paul's words of persuasion. Do you know those toys for small children where the child has to fit different shaped blocks through the corresponding shaped hole? There's no way an oblong block is going to fit through a square hole. You can't force the blocks. First, you find the right shape to match the right hole, and then you adjust the position of the block so that it lines up correctly. Once you've done that, the block fits easily. Persuasion is a bit like that. The box that receives the shapes is sort of like the human heart or mind, and the shapes that fit into the box are like pieces of the gospel message, ideas and beliefs. You can't force someone to accept or believe something that doesn't fit for them. You have to understand the shape of the person's heart and mind, and then position the idea or belief in a way that person can accept. Paul understood this. Paul did not coerce or manipulate people into accepting the gospel about Jesus. As verse 4 of Acts 17 tells us, Paul persuaded people. Paul thought about the shape of his listeners' hearts and minds and presented the gospel message in a way they could receive, without compromising or changing the gospel, and without damaging his listeners' hearts. Thessalonica was the capital city of the province of Macedonia. Verse 2 of Acts 17 tells us that Paul went to the synagogue as was his custom. The synagogue was like the local place of worship for people of Jewish faith living in that area. On the Sabbath, a Saturday, people came together in the synagogue for prayers and singing psalms and hearing the Hebrew Bible, what we know as the Old Testament, read aloud and expounded. It was Paul's custom to go to the Jewish synagogue on the Sabbath because he had done that all his life. While the Jewish faith is not exactly the same as the Christian faith, the two hold quite a bit in common. The Christian faith grew out of the Jewish faith. The very first Christians were Jews. From a mission strategy point of view, it made good sense for Paul to preach the gospel of Jesus in the synagogue because the people there were starting with the same shared understanding of God. This shared understanding included, for example, the belief that there is only one God, the creator of all there is, and he is just and merciful. Although Luke tells us Paul talked about Jesus in the synagogue over the course of 3 Sabbaths, this does not exclude the probability that Paul also talked about Jesus in people's homes and the marketplace during other days of the week. Luke's account is not a comprehensive report of Paul's activities. It's more of a highlights reel. What we notice in these verses is the way Paul went about persuading people to believe in Jesus' death and resurrection. Paul understood better than anyone how difficult it was for Jews to believe that Jesus was the Messiah when Jesus had been crucified. The idea of a crucified Messiah was a key piece of the gospel that did not fit easily with the Jewish mindset. To suggest that God's Messiah had to suffer and die on a cross was like trying to fit a square peg through a round hole. The Hebrew scriptures carried authority for the Jews, and so Paul reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. Reason, explanation, and evidence were key tools in Paul's toolbox of persuasion. We can easily imagine Paul using passages like Isaiah 53, which predicted the suffering of the Messiah, as a way of proving that Jesus had to suffer and rise from the dead. Isaiah 53 reads, "Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied." Verse 11 is talking about resurrection after death, you see. "By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." Isaiah 53 fits for Jesus, the suffering Messiah. While it is Paul's persuasive preaching that Luke highlights in Acts 17, it wasn't just Paul's words alone that convinced the people to believe in Jesus. As Paul himself writes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 5, "Our gospel came to you not simply with words, but also with power, with the Holy Spirit and deep conviction. You know how we lived among you for your sake." This tells us the Thessalonian believers were persuaded not just by Paul's words, but also by Paul and Silas's example, their lifestyle and deeds. More importantly, though, the Thessalonians were persuaded by the power of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit of Jesus is a spirit of truth and grace. The Holy Spirit works in our heart and mind to create the right-shaped opening to receive the gospel message with deep conviction. God's Spirit enables us to recognize when something is true. Paul was mindful of his listeners in the way he presented the gospel message, but he also recognized that ultimately the effectiveness of his message depended more on God's Spirit than anything else. Returning to Acts 17, verse 4 tells us of 3 groups of people who were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. In other words, they became followers of Jesus. These groups included Jews, many God-fearing Greeks, and a number of prominent women. We might pass over that without thinking much of it, but it's actually quite illuminating. These days, Paul gets quite a bit of criticism for what he writes in relation to women. Paul's thinking may be misunderstood by people today, but the fact that many prominent women responded positively to Paul's presentation of the gospel strongly suggests that the women of the first century quite liked what Paul had to say. Not everyone liked Paul's words, though. Some of the Jews were not persuaded. In fact, some were so jealous at Paul's success in winning converts that they organized a protest against Paul and Silas. The jealous ones formed a mob and started a riot. What happened next mirrored in some ways Jesus' experience. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king called Jesus." There are few things less trustworthy than a crowd. The organizers of the protest were basically accusing Paul and Silas of high treason. In today's terms, it would be similar to saying they were terrorists. The accusation was untrue and unfair. We are reminded here of Jesus' words in Matthew 10. "Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Jesus is not promoting war or violence. He's not talking in military or political terms. He's talking in spiritual terms. The point here is that there is no sitting on the fence with Jesus. You have to choose which side you're on, spiritually speaking. And there are real consequences to the choice you make. Jason made the choice to show hospitality to Paul and Silas. The eternal unseen consequence of this was that Jason was joined to Christ, destined to share in Jesus' glory. The temporal felt consequence for Jason was finding himself at the sharp end of a protest and legal action. When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. In other words, the magistrates put a legal obligation on Jason and the other Christian believers to get Paul and Silas to leave town. If Paul and Silas stayed, then Jason and the other believers would face some kind of penalty like losing their homes or going to prison. Paul and Silas did not want Jason and the new believers to come to harm, so they left quietly in the night without making a fuss. Some years ago, I worked in a cycle and mower shop. At times, we came across nuts and bolts that were seized together with rust and age. If you tried to force the nut off, you ran the risk of breaking the bolt or slipping and skinning your knuckles. As Aesop once said, it is better to use persuasion than force. Most of the time, you can persuade a rusty nut to come off with patience and a squirt of CRC. No damage done. The jealous ones who organized the protest against Paul did not use reason or truth to persuade the authorities. They used lies and fear. They twisted the facts and manipulated the situation so that Paul and Silas were forced to leave. The problem with using force is that it usually has unintended consequences. Those who were out to get Paul unintentionally promoted the spread of the gospel. By organizing a protest against Paul and Silas, pretty much everyone in the city became aware of Jesus. Now, it's thought that Thessalonica had a population of about 200,000 people in the first century. At least some of those 200,000 people would have become curious to learn more about Jesus. Without intending to, the protest organisers actually gave weight and credibility to Paul's message. They signalled to everyone that the gospel in the name of Jesus is a powerful thing that should be taken seriously. The gospel is powerful, but not in the way the authorities feared. God has a sense of humour. Less than 300 years later, the emperor would become a Christian. One other unintended consequence of the protests was the strengthening of the new believers' faith. After a potter has shaped the clay into the vessel they want, a bowl or a cup, they then put the soft clay into a kiln to be fired. The heat of the kiln sets the clay and makes the vessel strong. By putting heat on Jason and the other believers and dragging them before the authorities, the protest organisers actually made the new believers' faith stronger. Having suffered for their newfound faith, Paul's converts were more resolved to stick with Jesus. Reading between the lines of Acts 17, we see that God has a way of working adverse circumstances for good. This pattern of persuasive preaching followed by strong protest was not unique to the city of Thessalonica. Time and again in the book of Acts, Paul and his friends had to flee from one city to the next. Which brings us to the third P in today's message, persistence. Paul was relentlessly persistent in persuading people to receive Jesus. Persistence is about never giving up. We see Paul's persistence in the wider context of Acts. Before arriving in Thessalonica, Paul had been preaching the gospel in Philippi. With the help of the Holy Spirit, Paul managed to persuade a small group of people to believe in Jesus, including Lydia, the seller of purple cloth. But it wasn't long before someone protested against Paul, and he found himself being flogged and thrown in prison. Once they had been released from prison in Philippi, Paul and Silas didn't give up. They carried on, making the 100-mile journey, probably on foot, to Thessalonica, where they were forced to leave again for the next town, Berea. Fortunately, Paul's reception in Berea was more positive. Paul's persistence paid off. As someone once observed, water cuts through rock not because of its power, but because of its persistence. Of course, even persistence has its limits. The goal is not to be so stubborn that we never give in. The goal is to be sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit, that we may go the distance in God's will for us. So what do these three Ps, persuasion, protest, and persistence, mean for us as Christian believers today? Well, persuasion has a number of points of application. Before we can persuade anyone else that Jesus died and rose from the dead, we must first be persuaded of Jesus' resurrection ourselves. We must know what it is we believe about Jesus with deep conviction and hold to it. Persuasion also requires us to be respectful of others who have different beliefs from us. What may seem simple and straightforward to you may be incredibly difficult for someone else to accept. It does no good to force our beliefs on other people. Like Paul, we need to be ready to speak about our faith with gentleness and an understanding of how the other person thinks, trusting the Holy Spirit to create the right shaped opening in their heart and mind. We must not be surprised or discouraged by protests against what we believe. When you become a Christian, you choose a side, spiritually speaking. You're not likely to be driven out of town like Paul was, but there is a good chance you will be misunderstood and misrepresented if you identify yourself as a Christian. Don't take it personally. It's not really about you. The Christian message has often been unpopular and met with resistance. Take heart. God is more than able to use the efforts of those who protest against him for good. Finally, we must persist in our witness for Jesus. Sometimes that will mean quietly going about our lives, letting our actions speak for us. Other times that will mean proclaiming aloud our deepest convictions about Jesus. Whatever happens, hold to Christ, and be sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit. Let us pray. Lord Jesus, help us to know you more deeply, to love you more dearly, and to share you more freely with the help of your Holy Spirit. Amen.